Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are stepping into, well, one of the most intense and complex corners of the modern environmental conversation. We're talking about the world of those often labeled doomers.
Yeah.
Now, if you hear that term, you might picture one specific kind of person, maybe quite grim.
Right. A single image probably comes to mind.
But our sources reveal a vast and honestly surprisingly diverse philosophical landscape here.
Oh, absolutely. It's anything but monolithic.
Yeah.
You know, the observer Sam Mitchell, we'll talk more about him later, he famously noted something like, if you ask 15 doomers for a definition of what doomer means,
You get way more answers back.
you get 16, 20, maybe even more answers. It just highlights the incredible diversity of thought we're dealing with. You've got scientists fixated on, like, exponential decay curves on one side.
Okay.
And then, spiritual guides focus entirely on acceptance and processing grief on the other. It's a huge spectrum.
So our mission today isn't just to list all these different philosophies. We want to synthesize them. Our source material thoughtfully identifies 15 distinct types. We've grouped them into maybe 4 main philosophical camps. The idea is to understand not just what they predict, usually some form of collapse, but why they predict it. What do they see as the root cause?
And that context is really vital here. This whole typology, this act of carefully categorizing, it's actually a direct intellectual reaction.
A reaction to what?
Well, the authors felt that the doomer position was often being reduced to a kind of straw man in mainstream books, political commentary.
Ah, okay.
They reference critiques found in works like Genevieve Gunther's The Language of Climate Politics. So this list is essentially, it's a defense.
Interesting.
It's showing that the so-called doomer position is actually deep, it's nuanced, it's structurally critical, not just like an emotional outburst.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's unpack this. Let's jump right into our first major group.
Let's do it.
We're calling them the systemic critique doomers. Now, for this camp, collapse isn't primarily about, say, geology or physics. It's caused by broken, exploitative human systems. Systems they believe are just incompatible with long-term survival.
Exactly. This is where politics and economics really take center stage as the mechanism of doom, if you will.
Right.
So look at the anti-capitalist goomer, their core idea. Climate change is simply the inevitable endpoint, the structural death knell of neoliberal economics.
So the system itself is the problem.
Fundamentally, the system demands endless growth, profit-driven exploitation.
Yeah.
And that's just fundamentally at war with a finite planet. They see it as an impossible equation.
Naomi Klein, she's warned extensively on this front, hasn't she?
She has. She argues that unless the economic structure is dismantled, we are basically heading for an era of, and this is her term, climate barbarism.
Climate barbarism. What does that entail?
It's not just rising seas, It's a societal breakdown marked by extreme inequality, resource wars, massive migration crises. Basically, the powerful protect themselves and everyone else suffers.
Grim picture.
Then you've got the radical ecologist doomer. They take that critique even deeper. For them, the crisis is the unavoidable outcome of industrial civilization's fundamental war on nature.
A war on nature.
Yeah, and they often link the problem not just to capitalism, but also to things like patriarchy, anthropocentrism, this idea that humanity sits above all other life forms.
And they're not fans of typical environmental solutions.
No, they explicitly reject incremental reforms, things like green technologies. They often see those as just market-based solutions that distract from the real root problem.
Like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound.
Pretty much. The philosopher Derek Jensen captures this perfectly. He argues that if we accept, consumer choices as the only way to make change,
And the system wins.
then they've won, exactly. This group often advocates for a return to more radical, localized systems, maybe informed by indigenous wisdom.
Okay. And who else is in this systemic critique camp?
Well, anchoring this group, you have the civil disobedience doomers. They also accept that societal collapse is looming, maybe inevitable.
But they want to act.
Yes, but they view nonviolent disruption as a moral imperative, a necessary shock to jolt the rest of society out of its complacency.
So this is the activist wing we hear about.
That's right. They justify quite radical tactics, think blockades, mass strikes. They do this by calculating the worst-case scenarios.
And deciding drastic action is the only rational response.
The only proportionate response, yeah.
Yeah.
They generally reject electoral politics as futile or too slow.
Roger Hallam, one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion, he fits here, right?
He does. He provided one of the most drastic warnings from this camp, didn't he?
Yeah.
Claiming that if we continue on the current path, well, his words are stark, we are looking at the end of most life on Earth.
Wow.
So if we kind of synthesize this first group, the anti-capitalists, the radical ecologists, the civil disobedience types,
What's the common thread?
it's this profound belief that collapse is fundamentally a failure of our political and maybe moral imagination. They conclude that no technological fix, no clever invention can solve the crisis unless the base economic, social, and political structures are completely broken down first, or radically changed, at least.
That distinction, focusing on human systems versus maybe planetary ones, takes us neatly into our next major category.
Exactly.
The biophysical limits doomers. So if the first group focused on human rules and social failures,
This group focuses on Earth's immutable rules, the hard constraints.
physics, finite resources, ecological feedback loop.
Yeah, the stuff that doesn't negotiate, right? Systems that operate whether we like it or not.
This sounds like where the complex modeling comes in.
It often does. Let's start with one that's a bit esoteric, but really powerful conceptually. The Gaia hypothesis doomer.
Ah, James Lovelock's idea.
Exactly. Made famous by Lovelock. This worldview interprets climate change as Earth Gaia, this self-regulating superorganism basically rebelling against destructive human overreach.
So climate change is like Earth fighting back.
Pretty much. It's seen literally as Gaia's immune response to what it perceives as a virulent infection, which in this view is us, industrial humanity.
And the prognosis from that perspective.
It's brutal, frankly. Lovelock predicted that the necessary feedback loops, think massive methane releases from thawing permafrost, rapid ice melt.
The things scientists warn about.
Right, that these would kick in to eventually stabilize the system, but likely at the expense of our current complex civilization.
So stabilization through reduction.
Through massive reduction. He explicitly predicted, quote, "It will be death on a grand scale from famine and lack of water." And he dismissed things like geoengineering as just suicidal human hubris, trying to control the uncontrollable.
Okay, that's a heavy perspective. Shifting from that more spiritual or systems view.
Let's talk raw numbers, unforgiving math.
Right. We encounter this cluster focused on overshoot and population.
Yeah, this is the core belief that humanity has simply exceeded the planet's carrying capacity.
Too many people using too many resources.
Fundamentally, yes, leading to an inevitable and potentially quite violent correction, a population bottleneck.
This idea isn't new, is it? It goes way back.
Oh, centuries. You can trace it back to the OG doomer, as the source calls him.
Thomas Malthus.
Thomas Malthus, yeah. He argued back in the 18th century that population growth tends to accelerate exponentially.
While food production grows linearly.
Exactly. The power of the earth to produce subsistence only grows linearly or arithmetically. So he concluded that eventually premature death must in some shape or other visit the human race. Checks on population were inevitable.
And that got amplified later on.
Famously, yeah, by the population bomb doomer type in the 20th century, like Paul Ehrlich.
I remember that book.
Right. He forecast, I think, only about a 10% chance of avoiding civilization collapse due to population pressures and resource depletion back then.
But the modern version isn't just about sheer numbers, is it?
Not entirely. It's evolved. It's also crucially about the intensity of resource use per person, especially in developed nations.
Right, the footprint.
Precisely. So today, that idea is quantified by the ecological footprint doomer, exemplified by someone like William Rees.
What do they focus on?
They use hard metrics, calculations, to show that humanity currently exceeds planetary boundaries by, well, estimates vary, but often cited as a staggering 50% or more.
So we're using 1.5 Earth's worth of resources each year.
Effectively, yes.
Yeah.
They are primarily concerned with this total resource intensity, the sheer throughput of materials and energy in the economy, and they tend to denounce green growth myths.
The idea we can decouple growth from impact.
Yeah, they see that as largely a fantasy because the total amount of stuff we extract, use, and discard is just fundamentally too high for the planet to sustain.
And this ties into another type.
Directly. It connects to the overshoot ecologist doomer, like William Catton. He linked this whole dilemma to what he called cargoism.
Cargoism, like cargo cults.
Sort of. Yeah, it's this shared delusion, he argued,
Yeah.
that an endless bounty of resources is just guaranteed forever, regardless of the warning signs, regardless of depletion.
Like nature is just an infinite warehouse for us.
Exactly. And Catton argued this mindset, this cargoism, is precisely what sets us up for a major bottleneck of scarcity and conflict, when the reality of those biophysical limits finally hits home hard.
Okay, so if we look at this second group, the biophysical limits doomers, Gaia, Malthus, overshoot, footprint people,
What connects them?
it seems to be this hard conviction that no amount of political will, no amount of human ingenuity can ultimately trump the fundamental laws of physics and biology.
Right. The planet has rules.
And they believe collapse is basically guaranteed the moment we exceed that carrying capacity. All our complex human systems are just maybe delaying the inevitable reckoning.
That framing takes us nicely into our third grouping,
Which is?
the mechanism and timing doomers. Now, these folks are often the data geeks, the speed merchants, you could say.
Focused on how fast things are unraveling.
Exactly. They're fixated on nonlinear acceleration, on feedback loops kicking in, and they often challenge mainstream scientific timelines, arguing that collapse is happening much, much faster than, say, the consensus reports might suggest.
Okay, who's the prime example here?
Well, the ultimate example, maybe the most controversial, is the near-term human extinction doomer, often abbreviated NTHE.
Near-term human extinction. That's pretty direct.
It is. They don't worry too much about the year 2100. They are intensely fixated on these nonlinear climate dynamics. Things like abrupt permafrost thaw releasing methane,
Right.
Arctic amplification, the Arctic warming much faster than the rest of the planet.
There's the knock-on effects globally.
Huge ones. Or, you mentioned the particularly terrifying term earlier, clathrate gunshots.
Can you quickly explain that again? It sounds dramatic.
It does. So clathrates are basically ice-like structures on the seabed or in permafrost that trap huge amounts of methane. The gunshot hypothesis is that if the oceans or tundra warm rapidly past a certain point, these clathrates could destabilize and release massive amounts of methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas very quickly.
Like pulling a trigger on warming?
Kinda, yeah.
Yeah.
A rapid spike in global temperatures over maybe just a decade or two. Now, it's debated how likely the gunshot scenario is, but the NTHE camp sees these kinds of abrupt possibilities as central.
So the NTHE folks argue that focusing on gradual average warming is misleading.
Dangerously misleading, in their view. Because of these potential nonlinear feedbacks, their timeline for catastrophic collapse, even potential human extinction, is extremely tight.
Decades, not centuries.
Or even less. Guy McPherson is probably the most famous proponent, and he very controversially stated something like, I can't imagine that there will be a human left on the Earth in 10 years.
That's an incredibly stark prediction.
It is. And look, that extreme timeline might sound dismissible, easy to reject for many people.
Understandably.
But you could argue it's part of the philosophical function of this group, to try and shock society out of what they see as gradualist complacency, to highlight the absolute worst-case, nonlinear possibilities that might be being ignored.
Okay. Who else fits into this mechanism and timing category?
Closely related, you have the know-it-all doomers, maybe not the most flattering name, but
What's their angle? Data focus.
very data-focused. These people often use rigorous, sometimes proprietary, metric-specific things like ocean heat content anomalies, particular ice sheet melt rates.
Stuff maybe not in the headline reports?
Often, yeah. And they use this data to argue, to try and prove, that official climate models consistently underestimate the real velocity of doom, the speed of change.
So they're saying the models are too conservative.
Essentially, yes. They work to expose the denial or maybe the cautious bias they feel permeates not just policymaking, but sometimes even academic projections that tend to rely on smoother curves rather than potentially exponential ones. Okay, and there's one more type in this speed focus group.
Yes, and it's probably the one most visible to the general public today. The social media doomer.
Ah, the online chroniclers.
Exactly. They are the relentless online voices, documenting real-time catastrophes, the floods, the fires, the heat domes, as essentially evidence that key tipping points have already been passed.
They're connecting the dots live.
Yes, and often arguing that the official scientific warnings are being sanitized or downplayed. Gail Zawacki is mentioned as an example, arguing that despite all the data, we're not taking climate change seriously. In fact, we're making things much worse. So they play a role in translating or maybe amplifying the scientific warnings.
Amplifying and often adding a sense of immediate lived urgency. Yeah. They are essential in pushing back against any sanitized version and showing the public what collapse might actually look like in real time.
Okay, so that third group, NTHE, know-it-alls, social media doomers.
What's the thread?
It seems to be this intense rejection of gradualism, a demand for unflinching realism based on the accelerating data they're seeing.
Speed matters, right.
Hmm.
For them, if things are already moving exponentially, then taking slow, incremental action is functionally identical to doing nothing at all.
That constant fire hose of catastrophic data, whether it's political failures or biophysical acceleration, it must take a toll.
It absolutely does. And that leads us perfectly into our final and perhaps most reflective group,
Which we're calling.
the philosophical and spiritual response doomers.
Okay, so the focus shifts here.
Completely. They aren't primarily focused on if collapse will happen or even why it's happening anymore.
They accept it as a given.
Largely, yes. Their focus shifts to how do we live ethically, emotionally, maybe even spiritually, with the inevitability of the end, or at least the end of the world as we know it.
This sounds like a move from external action to internal processing.
It really is. Take the ethical pessimist doomer. They confront the catastrophe with a kind of stoic wisdom.
Stoicism, like accepting what you can't control.
Exactly. They advocate for a kind of pragmatic fatalism. This encourages personal transformation, focusing on things you can control, like localized low-tech adaptations, community building, maybe grief rituals,
Rather than trying to stop the unstoppable.
rather than continuing what they see as the futile effort to avert the inevitable large-scale collapse.
Roy Scranton's work fits here, doesn't it?
Perfectly. He sums up the fundamental truth they start from. The bad news we must confront is that we're all going to die.
Which is true for everyone eventually, but they apply it to civilization.
Right, and this type argues that actually accepting impending civilizational doom paradoxically frees us. It frees us from the distractions of consumerism, from false hopes,
And allows for what?
allows us to pursue a more meaningful, authentic life connected to what truly matters while there's still time.
Okay. Then there's the deep adaptation doomer. This term has become quite well known.
It has, largely popularized by Jem Bendel. This framework formalizes that idea of acceptance.
How so?
They embrace societal collapse not just as possible, but as unavoidable or already underway. So the focus shifts entirely to what Bendel calls the 3 R's, sometimes 4 now, I think. Resilience. How do we prepare locally? How do communities withstand shocks? Relinquishment. What do we need to let go of? Systems, expectations, ways of life that no longer serve us or are unsustainable. And restoration. How do we try to heal both the planet where we can and ourselves spiritually and psychologically?
And they push back against easy fixes.
Oh yeah, they explicitly reject what he called fairy tale fixes, the idea that some magical technology or a simple policy change will save us at the last minute.
It sounds like it's about finding agency within the decline.
That's a great way to put it. As Bendel notes, people in this movement gather and sometimes rebel, not with a clear vision of some perfectly fixed future,
But why then?
but because it is right to do what we can. It's about maintaining ethical agency, doing the right thing, even in the face of what seems like inevitable civilizational decline.
And the final type in this philosophical group.
The final one is the post-doom spiritual doomer.
Post-doom. So beyond doom.
Kind of. This philosophy focuses on transcending the initial grief and despair associated with accepting collapse, moving to a state of post-doom.
What does that look like?
Well, they might view collapse not merely as a tragedy, although it involves immense suffering, but perhaps also as a kind of cosmic correction, or maybe an evolutionary impetus forcing humanity towards something new, even if it's very different.
Finding meaning even in the breakdown.
Trying to, yes. Michael Dowd was a key figure here. He urged listeners to, quote, find the gift beyond mere acceptance that ongoing climate change and abrupt climate change are already underway.
What kind of gift?
Maybe the gift of presence, of community, of appreciating finite time. This approach often involves counseling people through the stages of ecological mourning.
Like grief counseling.
Very much so. Ultimately aiming to help people live joyfully, with purpose, in the time we have, unburdened by the need for impossible systemic fixes that they no longer believe in.
Wow. Okay, so if we step back now and look across all 4 of these big groups,
From the anti-capitalists focusing on systemic change,
to the overshoot ecologists looking at hard limits,
the data analysts focused on speed.
and finally these philosophical and spiritual guys dealing with acceptance.
We really see the full scope of this intellectual and emotional landscape they're mapping out.
It's incredibly varied.
Hugely varied. Different timelines, different causes, different proposed actions or inactions. But despite all those massive differences,
There's a common thread.
I think there is one unifying rejection. They all fundamentally reject what they see as naive optimism bias. And they reject incrementalism, small, slow steps, as a remotely adequate response to a crisis they view as deeply systemic and utterly existential.
So underpinning it all is a shared sense of unflinching realism.
Unflinching, unrepentant realism about what they see as the true limits, be they political, economic, or biophysical, of our current civilization.